It was a cold January day. Franklin Pierce, his wife, and their young son Benny had just gotten on a train in Andover near Boston and were heading home. And at this time of the country's life, train riding was very exciting. People were used to walking or being in a horse and buggy, and being on a train was so fast and exciting. And Benny loved being on the train. Well, they had just left a family friend's funeral, and the mom and dad were kind of sad, but Benny was excited as he watched the bleak landscape of snow and ice just fly by the window. Well, unfortunately, a coupling broke that attached the boxcar that had the Pierce family in it to the rest of the train, and it disengaged from the rest of the train. And as the track kind of curved, the boxcar that the family was in jumped the track, crashed, and rolled down into a ravine. There was only one death in the entire accident, and it was young Benny. He died right in front of his parents as his head was crushed. And they took that image of their young son dying in their arms with blood and the tragedy of that. They took that with them into the presidency. You see, just 2 months before young Benny had died, Franklin Pierce had been elected to become president. And while Pierce had been a politician his whole life, and this was his dream, his wife had very different dreams. You see, she was very conservative and very quiet, and she hated Washington, D.C. She did not want her president to run for office. She believed that it was a sin to want that much power. And there had been some family struggles as he was trying to be elected, and she did not want it to happen. And when their son died, she was very clear that this was punishment for God. Your greed caused the death of our son. And Pierce, he took a very similar view. He believed that God was punishing him for his lust for power. And in his inauguration speech, he said, "You have called upon me in my weakness, and so now I must lean on you, the people, for my strength." And Pierce was a very weak president. He was a Northern Democrat, and Democrats at that time were very pro-slavery, and he ended up doing whatever the slaveholder state powers wanted him to do. He signed into petition the Kansas-Nebraska Act and really pushed for his party to do it, which erupted into bloody Kansas and a mini civil war out in Kansas as settlers fought to decide if slavery would expand or not. He sent in federal troops to quell riots in Boston as they tried to free a black man who had run away and was free in Boston for years. And the fugitive slave law was forcing him back. And the Bostoners said, "No, we are not doing this. You cannot take him." And he sent in troops. He sent in the Marines to force this black man to get on a boat to be sent back to his master in Virginia. At the end of his presidency, Pierce, who had been elected, when he was elected, was the youngest man at that time to be elected as president, and who was quite good looking, was a shell of the man that he had been 4 years ago. In fact, a reporter said, looking on him, it was ghastly. He felt like he was looking on a corpse. It's rumored that at the end of his presidency, someone said, "Mr. Pierce, what are you going to do next?" And he said, "The only thing left to do, get drunk." And while we're not sure if he actually said that or not, we do know that's what he did. When he left the office, he descended into a life of drinking and alcoholism. He struggled with alcohol and depression his whole life, but after the presidency, he really let himself go. He died with cirrhosis of the liver, the disease of the alcoholic. And I can't help but think that at the beginning of his presidency, and as the images of Benny's death flashed in his mind, how different it could have been if he had just changed the meaning of the tragedy of his life. He said, "God is punishing me." He said, "God has killed my son because of my sins. And that overwhelming guilt took away his vitality. It took away his strength. It took away his chance to try to heal the country and bring it into a better place. It killed him on the inside. Now, we live in a war-zone world where bad things happen to all of us. Some of us, like Franklin Pierce and his wife, have lost children. Others of us have lost possessions. Others of us have lost jobs or our health. We've all faced tragedy and unfairness. Some of us have been abused. Some of us have been rejected by people who should love us. Some of us have gone through divorce. We've all had terrible things happen to us. You're not going to live a life and not have something bad attempt to crush your spirit. And when that bad things happen, you can be like Pierce and say, this is because God is punishing me. This is because God is angry with me. This is from God. This is my fault. And you can go into this guilt and shame crazy cycle that will just take you to a very dark place. Or you can decide to trust in God. You see, around this same time, Robert E. Lee lost a child. And while he was devastated with grief, he came to a very different conclusion. He said, this is God's will, and I'm going to trust in him. And by choosing to trust in God, he had peace. Now, I disagree with Lee. I don't think it was God's will that his daughter die. But you can't argue with the results. One man said, God wanted my son to die and he's punishing me. This very dark view of God, and it led him to a very dark life. And Lee said, it was God's will that my child die, and I don't understand it, but God is still good and I will still trust in him. And even though I don't think it was God's will that his child die, look at his view of who God was. Lee believed God was good and he was trustworthy, even if he didn't understand why his child died. Pierce believed that God was dark and God was mean and God was punishing him by killing his son in one of the most disgusting, horrific ways, and it destroyed his soul. The truth is, bad things will happen to all of us. And if we believe Jesus is coming back soon, then even more bad things are going to happen to us. And when tragedy strikes, that's when our belief in God's goodness is tested to the max. Is God bad or is he good? Is he punishing me because I've been bad, or is he disciplining me and trying to train me? Is God angry with me or is God loving me? You see, the question is, when craziness hits the fan and tragedy strikes, is God good? Not why did this happen? Is this fair? Could I have done? No. Don't ask questions that you don't know the answer to. Ask, is God good? Pierce and his wife said, no, he's not. Lee and Lincoln also lost a son. His favorite son lost him in the White House. They said, God is still good. I don't know why. I can't explain it. But God is good. And I'm going to hold on to that. If you look at the best Bible characters in the story, the men and the women whose lives accomplished the most, you will find that they too suffered tragedy. But you will find that in the midst of their tragedy, they chose to trust in God. We know that Joseph, sold as a slave by his brothers, betrayed by his own family members, sentenced to die by the boys he had grown up with. On his way to Egypt, he knew he did not have long to live. He knew the life of a slave was going to be short and painful. And he said, God, I trust in you. Whatever I've got left in my life, I give to you. He could have decided that God was bad, that the God of his family had abandoned him and rejected him and sent him to slavery. But he did not. And he was faithful in Egypt. He did not worship the gods of the Egyptian. He did not sleep with the wife of his master. And God was with him and blessed him And Joseph saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people when the famine hit. When tragedy strikes, you've really got to dig deep and say, is God good or not? And it's your freedom to choose. But here are the results of those choices. If you say God is not good, you too will end up like Pierce, a broken, shallow corpse of a person. But if you say that God is good and I will trust him, then you will end up living in heaven. Life is hard. And I can't pretend to understand the pain and the tragedy that you've gone through or that you will go through. But I can just encourage you to trust in God, because he is good. He is good. Trust in him. God's got this. God bless.